Well, hello there, everybody. Today's lesson is on multiplying integers. So we're going to be working with applying and extending our understandings of operations with rational numbers. Today, the focus is on just multiplying integers. We'll get back to division in another lesson. The materials you need for this video are a pencil, a ruler, note 0, which is your unit 1 vocabulary, and notes 1, which is our integer rules. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I'd like you to do is on your Unit 1 vocabulary notes, go ahead and put a note 0, the number 0 in the upper right-hand corner, and you can work along with me. So we're going to be working with integers, but let's clarify, what is an integer? Well, an integer is any positive or negative whole number and 0. As you see on the right, there are some examples of integers listed. Positive numbers, some negative numbers, and 0, but not fractions or decimals. Pause the video and write down the definition and example on your notes 0. The other vocabulary word we're going to be working with today is product. The product is the result of a multiplication problem. So if the expression is 5 times 4, the product is 20. Pause the video and copy this vocabulary word's definition and example onto your note 0. So let's talk a little bit about multiplication. Multiplication is grouping numbers together, and we've seen multiplication represented in several different ways. You can use the X, you can use a dot, or you can use parentheses. We're most commonly going to be using parentheses. So if you see two numbers in parentheses and there's no operator in between the parentheses, so you don't see a subtraction sign or an addition sign between the parentheses, see there's nothing in this space right in between, then you have a multiplication problem. Let's now go to notes 1, entitled Integer Rules. In the upper right-hand corner, please label these notes 1, just like I did. A number is attached to the sign in front of it, so we're going to talk about multiplying rules today. Now on the left here, you see our multiplying rules. We have a positive times a positive is a positive times a negative is a negative times a positive is also a negative, and a negative times a negative is a positive. Now before we just apply the rules, let's see this demonstrated in a couple of different ways. If you're multiplying two positive numbers together, like we see here in example 1, this is telling us positive 8 times positive 7. This means 8 groups of 7. So if you wrote 8 groups of 7 of something, how many would you have? Well, 8 times 7 is 56. That should be review. You know how to multiply two positive numbers already. But let's demonstrate multiplying with negatives. Go down to this dashed line where you see modeling multiplication and division of integers with counters and the number line. We're going to start with the counters. So let's take a look at problem A here. Problem A says 2 times negative 3, which means 2 groups of negative 3. And you should be taking your notes along with me on your paper. So if we're going to make 2 groups of negative 3, we have one group of negative 3. So here's group 1. And then another group of negative 3 counters. Well, if I count them up, how many negative counters do we have? Or how many counters do we have? We have 6 counters, and their sign is negative. So the product of 2 and negative 3 is negative 6. Now go ahead and take your ruler and draw yourself a number line. We always have to have 0 on the number line. And sometimes a lot of students want to put it always in the middle, but we need to make it work for us. So it could go in the middle, it could go all the way to the right, all the way to the left, a little bit on the right, a little bit on the left, depending on what your numbers are. Since we know we're going to be in the negative direction a bunch, I'm going to put 0 on the right. And since 2 and -3 are pretty low numbers, I'm going to make a scale of ones. Go ahead and number your number line with me. All right, so we always start at 0, and we're making 2 groups of -3. So here we go. One group of -3, so that's group 1, and another group of -3. So we see we ended up at -6. So this is -3 in this group, and this is -3 in this group. 2 groups of -3, and again, we end up at -6. So the product of 2 and -3 is -6. Let's try that one more time. On B, we have -4 times 5, which might translate to -4 groups of 5. But that doesn't really make sense because we can't have a negative amount of groups. But the commutative property says that it doesn't matter the order that you multiply terms in. So -4 times 5 is the same as five times -4. Those two expressions are equivalent based on the commutative property. So we have 5 groups of -4. So let's demonstrate that with counters. So we have 1 group of -4, 2 groups of -4, 3 groups, 4 groups, 5 groups. Well, if we look, how many counters do we have? That's right, we have 20. And are they positive counters or negative counters? They're negative. So the product of -4 and 5, or 5 and -4, is -20. Let's grab our rulers again and draw ourselves another number line. I know I'm going to be pretty negative again, so I'm still going to put 0 on the right-hand side. However, this time we might want to pick a different scale. Because we have to get out to -20 eventually, let's pick a scale. Should we go by 1s, 2s, 4s, 5s? Well, we need groups of -4. So maybe we will skip count by -4. And so let's make our groups. We need 5 groups, but we start at 0. Here's group 1. There's -4 in that group. Group 2. Group 3. Group 4. And group 5. Where did we ultimately end up? -20. That's right. So -4 times 5, or 5 times -4, is -20. Go to the very, very back page of Notes 1. You'll see a blank page. I'd like you to try these 2 problems as we talk through them. What if we had a negative times a positive times a negative? We're going to get back to that problem after we apply the rules. So if you go back to this page here with integer rules, we already did example 1, a positive times a positive. Let's go ahead and label those. So we have a +8 times a +7 gets us a +56. Number 2, what's the sign on the 6? Well, signs are attached, or numbers are attached to the sign in front of it. So the 6, what's the sign in front of it? There is no sign, which means it's a positive. And the 3, what's the sign in front of it? It's a negative. So here we have a positive times a negative. Well, if we look, a positive times a negative is a negative. And 6 times 3 is 18. So our product is negative 18. Let's try again. What's the sign on the 4? Oops, that's right, it's a negative. What's the sign on the 5? Well, I don't see a sign in front of it, so that must be a positive. A negative times a positive is a negative. 4 times 5, 20. So our product is negative 20. And just one more example here. What's the sign on the 5? Well, a number is attached to the sign in front of it. So that 5 has a negative sign in front of it. So it's a negative. And the sign on the 12, same idea, also a negative. A negative times a negative is a positive. And 5 times 12 is 60. So the product is positive 60. You don't have to put that plus sign in front. You can write it without, and that still signals a positive 60. Let's go back to that challenge problem I posed for you that's on the back of your notes page. So if we have 3 integers that we're multiplying together, let's see what would happen here. We might want to take it 2 at a time. So we have a negative times a positive. Well, a negative times a positive is a, you guessed it, a negative. So then we'll bring down the other integer, and then we'll use our rules once more. A negative times a negative is a positive. So the result of multiplying a negative, a positive, and a negative ends up being positive. And here's our last example. We're still on the back page of notes 4 where it's blank. What if we multiplied 3 negative integers together? Pause the video and try it yourself. Well, let's see. First, a negative times a negative we know is a positive. And then we bring down our other integer. In this case, we're just talking about signs. Sorry about that. A positive times a negative we know is a negative. So the product of 3 negatives is negative. Were you able to get that right? Great job. That's the end of our first video.